In the last lesson, we talked about the reasons why the government might want to intervene at the microeconomic level. Now, we're going to be learning about how they actually do it. The first type of intervention we'll look at is price controls. Price controls involve setting a minimum or maximum price by the government so that prices are unable to reach their equilibrium determined by the supply and demand of the free market. Since the price can't reach the equilibrium level, we say that the market is in disequilibrium, and the result is either shortages or surpluses. When a maximum price is set, this is called a price ceiling, and the product cannot be legally sold at a price higher than this. When a minimum price is set, this is called a price floor, and the product cannot be legally sold at a price cheaper than this. That's pretty easy, but a lot of students make mistakes when it comes time to draw the price controls on a diagram. That's because when you hear the word ceiling, you automatically associate it with being at the top, and you associate floor with being at the bottom. But with price controls, it's flipped upside down. Remember that a price ceiling is a maximum price. The government does this to prevent things from getting too expensive. This means the equilibrium price would be higher, but the price ceiling is blocking it from getting there. In other words, a price ceiling is a price below equilibrium. And a price floor is a minimum price. The government does this to prevent things from getting too cheap. This means the equilibrium price would be lower, but the price floor is blocking it from getting there. In other words, a price floor is a price above equilibrium. So just remember that it's flipped upside down, and hopefully you won't make that mistake on your test. Now, let's take a closer look at the price controls separately, starting with price ceilings. Once again, a price ceiling is when the government sets a maximum price below the equilibrium price. This is primarily done to protect the consumer when the government thinks the free market price would be unaffordable for too many people. The classic example of a common price ceiling is rent control, where governments put a limit on the rent that landlords can charge. Now, let's think about what happens on a diagram. At the equilibrium price, PE, supply and demand intersect, and the market clears. But when a price ceiling, PC, is introduced, it is set below equilibrium. As you can see, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. This creates a shortage or excess demand. At the price ceiling level, the quantity supplied by firms, QS, is less than the equilibrium quantity, QE, that suppliers would have supplied at the equilibrium price. But not only that, the lower price of the price ceiling actually creates more demand. We can see that on the diagram as the quantity demanded, QD, is actually more at the price ceiling level than at the equilibrium price level. This means that there will never be enough supply to meet the demands of the people. Therefore, the market will not clear and disequilibrium will continue. In our rent control example, this would mean more people want apartments at the lower rent, but landlords are less willing to supply them, leading to long waiting lists or overcrowding. Besides the shortage, there are some more undesirable consequences for the market. If you remember from the earlier lessons, the price mechanism has a rationing effect. This distributes products to the ones that are willing to pay the most. This ensures that waste is minimized and resources are allocated efficiently. However, once a price ceiling is implemented, the price mechanism loses its rationing effect. Because there are consumers that are willing and able to pay the PC price but will not be able to. They will go unsatisfied. So then, how will the society decide who gets the product and who doesn't? The society would need to use non-price rationing methods. These are things like waiting in line and distributing the product on a first-come, first-served basis. Another example is a lottery system, where you get the product just by pure luck. Or it could be through favoritism. The seller may decide to give it to his friends or people he likes. And he might like you a little bit more if you gave him some nice gifts on top of the asking price.
You can probably see how these methods could cause problems for the people of the society. And if enough people can't get the products they want or need, it's very likely that underground markets will get created. This would mean that the people who were lucky enough to be able to buy the product are buying it at the price ceiling level and then reselling it in an underground market for a higher price to all the people who were not lucky enough to be able to buy one. These kinds of markets are obviously illegal, which then means the transactions aren't recorded, which means the government misses out on any revenue normally received from sales or income taxes. Not only that, the products in these markets are usually sold for a price that is even higher than the equilibrium price, meaning that the consumers pay more than they would in a free market. Another negative consequence is allocative inefficiency. The price ceiling creates a decrease in quantity supplied and an underallocation of resources of what society wants. This means that's welfare loss, and society is worse off as a result. We can see this on the diagram. Remember that allocative efficiency occurs when there is maximum social surplus, which is when marginal costs equal marginal benefit. In a free market, we can see that this happens at the equilibrium price. But by implementing a price control, we can now see that only the quantity QS is supplied and consumed. But it isn't enough. The people want more. So the people are missing out on additional units that they are willing and able to buy. This is represented by the area of the triangle B. Then the producers are missing out on additional revenue by being forced to sell at an artificially low price. This is represented by the area of the triangle D. The consumer surplus becomes the area of A plus C, and the producer surplus drops to just E. We can find the total social surplus by adding the areas of A plus C plus E. And we can find the total welfare loss by adding the areas of D and B together. Furthermore, we can see the allocative inefficiency if we label our demand curve as marginal benefits and supply curve as marginal cost. Now we can see that at the quantity supplied, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. This means that society is not getting enough of the product and there is an underallocation of resources to its production.
Now that you can understand the negative effects of price ceilings on the market, let's talk about the consequences for the various stakeholders. First, the consumers. Going back to the diagram, you can see the consumer surplus loses B but gains C as a result of the price ceiling. This means that consumers gain some but also lose some. This is because the consumers that were able to buy at the lower price are better off. However, not all consumers that wanted to buy the product could, so these consumers are left unsatisfied. The producers, on the other hand, are clearly worse off. They sell a small quantity at a lower price. You can see what that would do to their revenues by calculating the area of PE times QE, which would be the firm's revenue before the price ceiling, and then comparing that to the area of PC times QS, which is the total revenue after the price ceiling. Although there are no numbers on the diagram, we can just see that the rectangle is much smaller. This is clear when examining how the producer surplus shrinks from C plus D plus E to only E. We can come to the conclusion then that the price ceiling was much worse for the producers. Now, let's go a little bit deeper and think about who else might be affected. Well, first of all, whenever quantity supplied decreases, this means a decrease in production. And when production decreases, firms need less workers. This means that more workers are likely to be fired, or less workers are likely to be employed in the first place, due to the price ceiling. Either way, this means that unemployment increases, leaving workers worse off. Governments won't experience any significant change in budget. However, the government would gain political popularity among the consumers by lowering prices. Going back to our rent control example, we can see some interesting consequences. Yes, the price ceiling on rent allows housing to become more affordable to low-income workers. But we also see a shortage of housing, as the quantity of housing demanded at the legally maximum rent is greater than the quantity available. Because of this, there may be long waiting lists of interested tenants waiting for their turn to secure housing. Also, because of the price ceilings, the rentals may result in low or even no profits for the landlords. This means that they are unlikely to have extra money for regular maintenance or improvement of the property, leading to large amounts of run-down, poorly maintained housing across the city. This may also result in an underground market, where rental properties are sublet out at rents above the market price, which some people would pay due to the shortage created by the price ceiling. So, as you can see, although the price ceiling is designed to help people, it usually means that the majority of the people are now worse off. However, without these price ceilings, then the low-income families may not be able to find housing. This could create larger social problems like homelessness, crime, unemployment, and so on. This is a dilemma that governments face, and there's no perfect answer. There's always going to be a trade-off with advantages and disadvantages for each. This is very important for you IB students. During your exams, the IB wants you to consider both sides and give a balanced answer, discussing, analyzing, and evaluating both sides during your written tests. So remember to talk about both the advantages and disadvantages of price controls.
Okay, now let's talk about price floors, which is a price that is set above the market equilibrium price. Remember, the floor above and the ceiling is below. Don't get confused. Governments typically set a price floor for two reasons. They either want to provide support for farmers, or they want to protect low-skilled, low-wage workers by setting a minimum wage that would be above the market equilibrium level. If you notice, the first of these takes place in the product market and the second in the resource market. Although the outcome is the same, the effect on stakeholders will be different, so we'll talk about them separately, starting with supporting farmers with a price floor. As you can probably guess, even though this is done with good intentions, it has some very negative consequences. First, let's look at the diagram. So the price floor, PF, is set here, above the equilibrium price of PE. At the price floor level, since the suppliers are getting more money than they normally would, they are more than happy to keep on making more of the product. This is going to result in a quantity supplied that is much more than the quantity demanded. The consumers see the price as being too high, so that's going to limit the amount they buy. This results in excess supply, also known as a surplus. What normally happens for agricultural products in this case is that the government will buy the excess supply. We can illustrate that by shifting the demand curve over to the quantity supplied. But why would the government want to buy the excess supply? Well, you can probably imagine what would happen if a country doesn't have enough food to feed its people. So it is better if the farmers overproduce, since it's better to have too much food than not enough. However, if left to the free market forces, the tendency would be for the farmers to only produce what they knew they could sell, which would most likely result in underproduction. And also remember, a decrease in supply usually means an increase in price, so without price controls, a farmer would be incentivized to keep their production low, which is risky for a country that needs to feed its people. So, by having the government guarantee that they will buy anything that the farmer cannot sell, it allows the farmer to feel comfortable producing as much as possible while also protecting the farmer from volatile food prices. Now let's take a look at what that does to social welfare. At the equilibrium price, the social surplus, which is the producer and consumer surpluses combined, is maximized. Now let's introduce the price floor. The consumer surplus falls to the area under the demand curve and above the price floor, which is represented by A.
producer surplus grows to the area under the price floor and above the supply curve up to the quantity supplied, which is represented by B plus C plus D plus E plus F. As you can see, the social surplus actually increases by the area F. This happens because producers gain the area B and C lost by consumers and also gain area F from the government purchase. But it's a little more complicated than that. Government spending to buy the excess supply is equal to the price paid per unit at PF multiplied by the amount bought. So that would be PF times quantity supplied minus quantity demanded. This is represented by the rectangle of F plus H plus G plus E plus C. Remember that the money used to purchase the excess supply from the farmer comes from the taxes of the people. Think of the opportunity costs involved. This tax money could have been spent on improving roads, hospitals, schools, but instead went to buy food nobody wants. So, while there is a gain in producer surplus of F, the rest of the rectangle represents welfare lost to society of resources that could have been used more efficiently. This means that society would be better off if less of the good was produced. And now the government needs to decide what to do with the excess supply. They can simply store it for later, but this would involve additional costs, and also the risk that some of the product goes bad, since we're talking about food here. Usually, they'll try to export it and sell it to other countries. However, remember that because of the price floor, the price is higher than it should be, making it much more difficult to be competitive in world markets, so the government will usually also implement a subsidy. Subsidies will be discussed in more detail later on, but for right now, you just need to know that this is money from the government given to the producers in order to keep the price low. But as you can see, this would also involve additional costs for the government. In other words, no matter what the government decides to do, the result will be problematic. An additional problem that arises from a price floor is inefficiencies. As you'll learn about later when we study monopolies, whenever a firm can sell its product at an artificially high price, it causes inefficiencies in the market. A firm in a very competitive market will do everything it can to keep its costs low while still producing as much as possible. This not only helps the firm be more competitive, but also keeps prices low, benefiting the customer as well. But it also often results in new, innovative technology and production methods which eventually benefit all of society. A firm that does not need to compete usually does not strive to find these innovations or even care about wasted resources because their revenue is essentially guaranteed. This also leads to allocative inefficiency, as too many resources are allocated to the production of a good that is higher than what society wants or needs, resulting in waste.
Now that you understand the effect of price floors on markets, let's consider the effects on stakeholders. Obviously, it's bad for consumers, since they now must pay a higher price for the good at a smaller quantity. But then, that's good for the producer, since they receive a higher price and produce a larger quantity, since the government buys the surplus. This would mean that they would increase their revenue from PE times QE to PF times QS. They also have more protection from competition and are less likely to go out of business. And since the producers will overproduce, they will need more workers. So the price floors benefit workers, since more of them will need to be employed, and at possibly higher wages. Governments lose out, since the purchase of the surplus comes out of their budget, resulting in less money for other things. In addition, there will be extra costs involved for storage, either for later consumption or export. This then means that the citizens lose out, since the money comes from their taxes. If many governments export their surplus, this will cause an oversupply of the product in the global market, resulting in a big decrease in price. For more developed countries, they can take the loss much better due to the diversity of their economy, where they will make up the loss with the sales of other products. However, a lesser developed country that has an agriculturally based economy is much more dependent on these sales.
Therefore, this situation is much more harmful for less developed countries.
Next, let's talk about a different type of common price floor, the minimum wage. Almost every country in the world has a minimum wage, which is set up to protect low-income workers. But once again, we'll see that even though it's done with good intentions, this has some negative consequences as well. Let's start with the diagram of the market for labor. The demand curve shows the quantity of labor that firms are willing and able to pay for at each wage level. The supply curve then shows us how many workers are willing to work at that wage level. Obviously, the higher the wage, the more motivated people are to work, increasing the labor force. So when a minimum wage, WM, which is a price floor, is set above the equilibrium wage, WE, it once again creates a surplus in the market. That means there are more people willing to work, but less firms willing to hire them, creating excess supply. The quantity of labor demanded, QD, is less than the quantity demanded at the equilibrium wage. Therefore, the amount of surplus can be measured as the difference between QD and QS. These are people that want to work but cannot find a job, which makes them unemployed. The unemployment is due to a decrease in the labor demanded by firms, defined by the difference between QD and QE, and also the increase in the quantity supplied, defined by the difference between QS and QE. The decrease in labor demanded is due to the higher wages, which means higher production costs. Firms would then hire less workers as a result to keep costs down. The increase in quantity supplied is caused by the motivation of more people to work for a higher wage. This usually only affects low-skilled workers, since wages for high-skilled workers would be above the minimum wages anyway. So, when a minimum wage is imposed, it affects firms and industries that rely heavily on low-skill labor, and thus will hire less workers as a result. This would then cause a decrease in production and shift the supply curve to the left, since firms will no longer be able to produce the same quantity at the same price as before. However, if the firm can find some workers that are willing to work for less than the minimum wage, then the firms may decide to hire those workers, even though this would be illegal. This creates a black market for labor and usually involves illegal immigrants that aren't allowed to work in the country normally. But since the production costs would be less, the firm can once again hire more workers while paying each one a lesser amount. Now let's examine the consequences of a minimum wage on various stakeholders. First of all, the firms. Clearly, they're going to be worse off, since they'll face higher production costs, leading to a decrease in output. The workers, however, will have mixed outcomes. Some will benefit by earning a higher wage than they otherwise would have. However, many will be left unemployed with no wage at all. You can see the amount of people that will lose their job represented by the difference between QE minus QD. And this is added to the amount of new workers motivated to work by the higher wages but cannot find a job, represented by the difference between QE and QS. Consumers are clearly worse off, as they will now face lower quantity supplied and higher prices. So, if it's so bad, why does practically every country in the world have a minimum wage? Among economists, minimum wages are controversial, but not for the reasons you might think. Most economists will agree that minimum wages help to promote better equity and income distribution and overall economic well-being of a country. Instead, the controversial part comes from arguments on how high to set the minimum wage above the equilibrium wage. It is questionable whether a minimum wage leads to the amount of unemployment that economic theory predicts. A growing number of studies actually show that a minimum wage, as long as it's not set too high above the equilibrium wage, will have no effect or even a positive effect on unemployment. Adding to this, the use of a minimum wage is very popular amongst the people of a country, and their use is likely to continue, regardless of the drawbacks that we discussed earlier. And that's going to be all for the SL students.
To sum up, price ceilings and floors are policies designed to protect vulnerable groups, like tenants, workers, or farmers. They do provide short-term benefits, but they also cause distortions, shortages, surpluses, and inefficiencies in markets. Evaluating them means weighing these trade-offs carefully and considering the long-term impacts on all stakeholders.
Now, for you HL students, we need to learn how to calculate the exact effects of these price controls. Let's start with price ceilings. Let's say the market equilibrium is a price of $4 at a quantity of 20 units per week. The government imposes a price ceiling of $2.50, represented by PC. Because of the lower price, quantity demanded rises to 30,000 per week, represented by QD, but quantity supplied falls to 10,000, represented by QS. We can calculate the excess demand, or shortage, simply by subtracting the quantity demanded by the quantity supplied. In this example, it would be 30,000 minus 10,000, which equals 20,000 units per week. Consumer expenditure is calculated by multiplying price and quantity. To find the change in consumer expenditure, first we find the value at equilibrium. That would be PE times QE, or $4 times 20,000 units, which equals $80,000. After the price ceiling is imposed, consumers then spend PC times QS, or $2.50 times 10,000, which equals 25,000. We can then subtract the two numbers, so 80,000 minus 25,000, and we find that the consumers now spend $55,000 less than before the price ceiling. How about the change in producer revenue? That's easy. It's going to be exactly the same as consumer expenditure, both before and after the price ceiling, which makes sense because consumer expenditure becomes the revenue for the producer. So the producer revenue before the price ceiling is $80,000, and after the price ceiling, it falls to $25,000, giving us a decrease of $55,000. Now, let's try to calculate consumer and producer surplus. Remember that consumer surplus is the area of this triangle, producer surplus is the area of this triangle, and total social surplus is the two added together. So the initial consumer surplus is found by taking the height, which is 7 minus 4, or 3, and multiply that by the base, which is 20,000, and we get 60,000. Then we divide by 2 to get 30,000, and remember, this is a monetary value, so we use dollars. And now let's see how the price ceiling affected the consumer surplus. You'll notice it's no longer a triangle, so we have to find the area of the trapezoid represented by A plus C, since we'll be losing B and D. Do you remember the formula for the area of a trapezoid? It's the sum of the two parallel sides times the distance between them divided by 2. So that's going to be 7 minus 2.5 plus 5.5 minus 2.5. This gives us 4.5 plus 3, which is 7.5. Okay, so that's the sum of the parallel sides. Now we multiply that by the distance. So that's 7.5 times 10,000, which is 75,000, then divided by 2 gives us the final answer of $37,500. We can then come to the conclusion that the consumer surplus has increased by $37,500 minus $30,000, or $7,500. Now pause the video and see if you can find the producer surplus both before and after the price ceiling. Then find the welfare loss that results from the price ceiling. All right, let's check it out. First, the producer surplus before the price ceiling. That's going to be the sum of areas C, D, and E. So the height of that triangle will be 4 times the base, which is 20,000, which gives us 80,000. We then divide by 2 to get a final value of $40,000. After the price ceiling is imposed, our producer surplus reduces to just E. Good news is that it's still a triangle, which makes it a little easier. So that's going to be a height of 2.5 multiplied by the base of 10,000, and we get 25,000. Divide that by 2, and we get a final producer surplus of $12,500. We can then subtract the two figures together and find that producer surplus has decreased by $27,500. For the welfare loss, we need to find the areas of B plus D. So that'll be a height of 5.5 minus 2.5, or 3, times the base, which is going to be the equilibrium quantity of 20,000, minus the quantity supplied of 10,000, which is 10,000 units. That equals to 30,000, and then we divide by 2, and we get a welfare loss of $15,000. Okay, now let's try to do the same for a price floor. I want you to pause the video and try to calculate the surplus or excess supply, the change in consumer expenditure, the change in producer revenue. Now, be careful on that one. Remember how with the price ceiling, the consumer expenditure and the producer revenue were the same, right? But now it won't be the same. Why? Because we remember the government buys the surplus. So the producers are going to make additional revenue from the government plus the revenue they make from consumers. So that might be a little tricky, but give it a shot and see if you can get it. After that, I want you to find the change in consumer and producer surplus as well as the welfare loss. I know it's a lot, but let's see how you do.
All right, let's check it out. First up is the excess supply. That's easy. It's going to be the difference between quantity demanded at 200 and quantity supplied at 400. This gives us an excess supply of 200 units. Up next is the change in consumer expenditure. So before the price floor, consumers bought 300 units at $10. That's going to be a total of $3,000 in consumer expenditure. After the price floor, the consumers bought 200 units at $13, which totals to only $2,600, meaning a decrease in consumer expenditure by $400. Okay, here comes the tricky part. I hope you got it. So before the price floor is imposed, the consumer expenditure is equal to producer revenue, so that'll be $3,000, just as before. After the price floor is imposed and the government buys the surplus, now we're looking at the area of the rectangle of PF times QS. That'll be 13 times 400, which is $5,200. Therefore, to find the change in producer revenue, we take the difference between 5,200 and 3,000, and we get an increase of $2,200. How about government expenditure? As you can probably guess by now, we can find that by finding the area of the rectangle formed by PF and the difference between QD and QS. That'll be 13 times 200, which is $2,600. And this makes sense if you think about it, because producer revenue would be equal to consumer expenditure plus government expenditure. So that's a way you can check your work. The numbers should add up and be the same. Hopefully you got that right. The rest is very similar to the calculations for price ceilings. Let's start with the change in consumer surplus. The initial consumer surplus is the triangle of ABC. So that's a height of 10 times a base of 300, which is 3,000. And then we divide by 2 to get an initial consumer surplus of $1,500. After the price floor, the consumer surplus shrinks to just triangle A. So now we've got a height of 7 times 200, which is 1,400. After dividing by 2, we get a final answer of $700. This means a loss of $800 in consumer surplus. On to producer surplus. The initial value will be the area of triangle DE. That'll be a height of 10 times a base of 300, which is 3,000, divide by 2 gives us an initial producer surplus of $1,500. After the price floor, the producer surplus grows to the area of triangle BCFD. To calculate the area, we take the height of 13 times the base of 400 to get 5,200. Divide by 2, and we get $2,600. This means that the producer surplus increased by $1,100. The welfare loss is then going to be the spending of the government for buying products at a price no one wanted. However, there is still producer surplus gain of triangle F, so we need to subtract that.
In other words, we take the area of F, which would be a height of 3, times a base of 200, which gives us 600, divided by 2 is $300. The government spending, as calculated earlier, is equal to $2,600, so we then subtract 300 and we get a welfare loss of $2,300. And that's all you need to know for this lesson. Here's the learning objectives. Pause the video and do a self-check to make sure you know everything. As always, leave any questions in the comments, and thanks for watching. See you next time.